Night spread across Coruscant like a sheet of smoked glass, the planet's endless rivers of traffic burning through it in lines of molten gold. The durasteel spires drank the glow and returned it in myriad reflections, each window a shard of a galaxy that thought itself stable. Somewhere, thunder muttered, not from weather. Coruscant had long ago traded the honesty of rain for climate regulation, but from the distant complaint of starship engines and the quiet percussion of power conduits deep in the skin of the city world. Wind that knew no sky tugged at robes as it swirled along walkways and between towers, smelling faintly of ozone and hot metal. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood at the edge of the landing platform, his hands braced on the rail as if it might teach him what the Force would not. He had come straight from Utapau with the taste of ash in his mouth and the memory of General Grievous collapsing beneath a bolt of blaster fire. The Separatist leader's death was supposed to change the current. Yet the Force had not eased. It folded in on itself, a knot tightening. Peace did not arrive on the wind as the Council had hoped. Instead, the air tasted like a storm biding its time. Beneath the hum of the platform's lamps, he felt Anakin's presence like an ember in the dark. Bright, familiar, and wrong. Their years together had woven a thread between them. Now that line ran hot as wire. Anakin was close, somewhere in the Palatine district where ambition made palaces into fortresses and truth wore a senator's smile. The thread tugged. Obi-Wan pressed lips together until they whitened. He could have turned toward the temple, toward the quiet stones and high halls that watched over the city and the Order's ancient heart. He could have gone to the council chamber and reported Grievous fallen, the war as good as finished, their soldiers ready to stand down. Instead, he turned toward 500 Republica, toward a narrower light. Padmé's apartment door opened before he reached for the chime. She had always been quicker than protocol. Her face, which had held the galaxy's attention since adolescence, was reduced now to the tight economy of someone counting every breath. Shadows slipped beneath her eyes. Heat rippled through the room from the fireplace. The smell was a carefully curated herb smoke designed to calm a guest. It did nothing for her. "Obi-Wan," she said, and something in his name cracked. He bowed his head slightly. "Senator." She flinched at the formality and then collected herself, smoothing one hand over the fall of a robe that could not hide what it was meant to hide. He had known for months but had not known how to speak of it. The Order did not train one to interpret love that refused to recuse itself from duty. At last he said it because the world had spun far beyond the safety of silence. "How far along are you?" Her gaze fell to the floor and then rose again, iron behind the velvet. "Far enough," she set her jaw. "If you've come to judge, save your breath. I haven't any to waste. I haven't come to judge." He reached out through the Force and felt the quick flutter of two small lights beneath her hands, sparks protected by flesh and fear. That brightness was unbearable in all the ways that mattered. "I've come to ask where he is." The iron wavered. She turned away, hands closing around the back of a chair until her knuckles whitened. "I don't know. He left hours ago. He's been not himself. I thought he would come back. He always comes back." Her voice caught on the edge of that word and fell. Obi-Wan crossed the room. The fireplace spit once, as if in objection. He wanted to put a hand on her shoulder and did not, because his touch would not fix anything. "There's a disturbance in the Force," he said softly. "A profound one. I fear it centers on the Chancellor." She laughed once, a small, bitter sound. "Everything does. Where is Anakin, Padmé?" Her eyes flicked to his. "I told you. Where would he go?" he corrected gently. "If he were not himself, where does he go when the room is on fire inside him?" She closed her eyes and stood very still, as if listening to a melody only she could hear. When she opened them, the gold brown had hardened. "The Chancellor's office," she said at last. "Or the temple. But you won't find him in one if he thinks you're looking in the other." "He thinks I suspect him," Obi-Wan said. He tried the weight of that sentence, found it too heavy, and carried it anyway. "Perhaps I do, but I know him." His fingers pressed the chair back near hers, steadying himself more than the furniture. "I will bring him home. Do you still have a home to bring him to? Her voice softened, and the strength she had built in years of Senate service shifted. He glimpsed the girl who had thrown herself between her people and anyone who would harm them. I told myself that the code would bend for the sake of life, that it would know what we know. Perhaps it did once. I need it to again. There was nothing to say to that except a truth too simple for politics. I will try, he said. The ember on the thread tugged again, close enough now that he could hear the ghost of footfalls. Lock your doors, and whatever you hear, stay away from the windows. From the windows? She breathed, eyes flicking toward the sweeping view of Coruscant beyond the glass. Towering spires, a river of speeders, the visible silhouette of the temple against the night. I've stared out of them every night waiting for him. He met her gaze. Not tonight. The corridor that led to the Chancellor's private offices was too quiet for Coruscant. A handful of Senate guardsmen stood at the threshold, double-bladed pikes held at a slant that suggested ceremony and promised violence. Beyond them, durasteel doors had been buckled outward by something immensely strong, or someone desperate. The air stank of rainless storm. Obi-Wan passed through the breach and into a room the Force remembered in shrapnel. Glass had exploded from the long windows, leaving the wind to pour through in cold sheets that made the curtains whip like pennants after a battle. Scorch marks stippled the carpet. The far end of the office had surrendered to open air. Lightning flickered, not from weather but from that other source that left a medicinal taste on the tongue and the gums aching. A man stood at the room's edge, his silhouette framed by broken glass and the night. He did not turn when Obi-Wan entered. The ember had grown to a furnace, but its heat was raw and unsteady, like a forge where the metal had been left too long and had begun to slump. Anakin's hands rested at the railing as if he was trying to hold the planet still. The wind flared his cloak out behind him, snapping it like a falcon's wing. He did not turn because he already knew who stood there. The thread between them made introductions unnecessary. I told myself you would not come, he said without greeting. His voice was lower than the last time Obi-Wan had heard it, hoarse with smoke and something older. I kept waiting to be wrong. Obi-Wan came forward, picking his way around a section of shattered transparasteel. Blue slivers crunched under his boots like brittle leaves. You were never good at being wrong, he said, and heard the restless humor fall flat behind the words. He let it. What happened here? Anakin did not look back. His knuckles were white where they gripped the rail. He killed them, he said, and the sentence bled. I tried. He swallowed, and his throat worked around names that would never again be said aloud. Master Windu is gone. The others were dead before I arrived. I thought I could stop it. He needed me to choose. He chose. And now the galaxy will drown for it. A long breath left Obi-Wan. The storm inside the Force answered with a shiver that ran from his shoulders to his heels. The Chancellor. Anakin laughed once. A brief, bright flare with no warmth in it. Chancellor. He has other names. The night tugged at their robes. Obi-Wan came to stand beside him, leaving an arm's length between them. They watched the traffic rivers curve around the Senate district as if nothing had changed, as if lights could be trusted simply because there were many of them. You knew, Obi-Wan said softly, not as an accusation but as a bloodless confession. Anakin turned his head slightly, enough that Obi-Wan could see the side of his face. His eyes looked older than his years and startlingly young. I told Mace. I told him Palpatine was the Sith Lord we've been searching for. He took 3 masters and went to arrest him. When I arrived, it was almost over. I thought. He stopped. Obi-Wan waited. He had always understood patience better than most. The wind worried at a strand of Anakin's hair that had wriggled free from its binding, like a boyish defiance that could not be completely tamed. I thought if I helped, if I prevented another death, if I just did this one wrong thing for a right reason, I could. It doesn't matter what I thought. His voice cracked. It mattered to me. I know, Obi-Wan said, and meant it with a completeness that made him dizzy for a moment. You thought you were saving a life and 1,000 lives that could have followed. You thought your fear could be bartered into mercy. You were wrong about the bargain. not about the desire. Anakin flinched as if struck. He finally turned. The face that had laughed in mess halls and frowned at engines and looked up at the night with wonder after their earliest victories looked back at him like a land all roads had led to whether he'd wanted them to or not. "Padme," Anakin whispered, the name a prayer and an apology. "I know," Obi-Wan repeated, the same words wearing another meaning. He had known without knowing since Geonosis, and he had kept his own foolish counsel because love felt like sunlight in a world of cold rules. He did not try to hide it now. He's been feeding your fear, turning it toward his ends. "He said there was a way," Anakin said, and bitterness choked the words. "To keep her safe, to hold back death itself. He told me the Jedi fear attachment because they cannot wield it. He said I could learn what they refused to teach." Obi-Wan looked at him and saw the boy on the dune sea, the boy in the hangar, the young man giddy with victory and prone to sleeplessness, the knight who had taken a Padawan and taught her how to be brave enough to leave them. He saw all the versions and none of them, and in that montage found his own fault like a stone beneath the tongue. He had loved Anakin as a brother and had, in some crucial place, failed to say so because the code did not give him the words. "The Order has made mistakes," Obi-Wan said. He felt the sentence like a glass he was setting down on a table where the slightest pressure would tip it. "I have made them. We have not always known how to teach what we expect. But the Force is not a ransom note written in a monster's hand. You do not buy life by giving him your soul." Anakin's throat worked. The ember inside him roared and guttered. "It's too late," he said. "I told him I would serve. He glanced back into the wreckage of the office, to the desk where emergency channels waited like loaded weapons. "He hasn't given the order yet, but he will. He wants me to lead the 501st to the temple. I don't know what I would have done when I got there." His voice fell, raw. "I do know. The door would have opened. The younglings trust me, Obi-Wan. They trust me." Obi-Wan felt the world tilt. He put a hand on the rail because the ground under him wasn't as reliable as the air. "Then we go back through that door," he said, the sentence quiet and unfamiliar in his mouth because it did not belong to the old script. "We go back into that room together, and we stop him from giving any order to anyone." Anakin's head jerked. The city's light made knives of his cheekbones. "You'd with me?" "Against him," Obi-Wan said. He heard the words, heard how they changed something fundamental and left a gulf where the old certainties had lived. He stepped into it and found that it held weight. "I'm not asking you to turn on the Order. I'm asking you to keep faith with what the Order was supposed to be, with who you are under all of it." He managed a small, fierce smile no one who didn't know him would have recognized. "Besides, in a duel with a Sith Lord, I find I prefer the numbers on our side." A laugh burst from Anakin that sounded like a man coming up from underwater. It died as quickly as it came. He studied Obi-Wan for a long heartbeat, the way he'd looked at cockpit readings when something felt off and he didn't yet know why. Then that hard, necessary brightness lit behind his eyes, the one Obi-Wan had seen before in moments when impossible odds made themselves wanted. "Together," he said. "Together," Obi-Wan echoed. They crossed the ruined office with their cloaks snapping and glass whispering against their boots. Beyond the shattered windows, the wind cut lines across the skin of night. Inside, the Force lay coiled like a serpent waiting for them to step where it wanted them. Obi-Wan felt the shape of the coming fight in the way the floor seemed to tilt toward the center of the room, as if gravity itself favored intensity. They did not announce themselves. Announcement was unnecessary. The door to the private inner chamber had sheared on its tracks. Anakin pulled it aside with a flex of the Force that sang of anger and restraint wedded uneasily for a moment. They stepped through into an alcove where light pooled in a white circle across polished stone. Palpatine stood at its edge, his back to them, one hand braced on a chair as if he had simply paused mid-nebulous task. The city's light spilled past him, cutting the room into planes. When he turned his head, calm, careful features angled in profile, features 1,000 holos had captured to teach children what leadership looked like. The Force around him was a theater with the house lights off, every seat full of breath waiting for a line. "Anakin," he said, voice velvet with deep current beneath. "You return at last, and you bring your master. How loyal." He smiled toward Obi-Wan, the kind of smile that suggested an invitation into confidence. "Master Kenobi, a distressing night for your order, I'm afraid." Obi-Wan did not look at Anakin. He kept his gaze on the man who had taught a republic to stand up straight and then taught it to kneel without noticing the difference. "It will be," he said, "for you." Palpatine's smile did not change. "Brave words. You should be careful with bravery. It burns quickly." Anakin stepped forward until he stood with his boots in the white light. The planes of his face were carved now from something that could fracture or hold granite together. "I know what you are," he said, the sentence very plain. "I know what you've done." "Do you?" The Chancellor's eyebrows lifted a fraction, a craftsman admiring his work from a new angle. "Do you understand the larger weave, my boy? How history holds itself together? The Senate is a hive of fear. The Order is an edifice perched on a hollowed foundation. They would have torn themselves apart no matter who pushed first." He inclined his head. "I offer shape, structure. You offered me a nightmare and called it a rescue," Anakin said. "You offered me her death postponed and everyone else's in its place." The mask slipped. It was only a fraction, but the Force saw it as a flame guttering to reveal the fuel beneath. The face that had fooled a world melted at the edges. What looked back at them from beneath was older, thinner, eyes that surged with a light that had nothing to do with sun or city. When he spoke again, the voice took on a timbre that made the room feel smaller. "You could have learned what no one since the oldest days has learned. You could have become the storm that reigns where it chooses. And instead you returned to the cage." His gaze flicked to Obi-Wan. "You were always going to be his chains." "You misunderstand the nature of chains," Obi-Wan said. He opened his hand. The saber leapt into it from his belt like a memory accepting its place in the present. He did not ignite it yet. The ritual had to be correct. "Yours are the only ones I see." Anakin's saber snapped into blue life. The sound filled the room, a familiar chord that had started songs and ended them, that had hummed like a lullaby in hangars and sang like a blade in the field. For a heartbeat the night outside answered, a few distant speeders' engines sinking as if the city too held its breath. Palpatine sighed. "If this is the language we will speak, let us be honest with it." The mask fell completely. Flesh seemed to sag as if years, forbidden and hoarded, had finally been allowed to show themselves. His hands, when they lifted, were claws around light. The red bar of his saber bloomed. He was on them like a storm breaking windows. Even expecting him, they were not prepared for the speed. Obi-Wan fell back and to the side, catching the first scything blow on a guard. He had learned so well his muscles spoke it without his mind's permission. The red blade struck blue. Light splashed the ceiling and crawled along the walls. Anakin met the second cut head-on, fury turning precision into something that could both slice and solder in the same motion. Palpatine slid between them, a flicker of black cloth and laughter not coming from a mouth, the sound of a pit guiding the fall of stones. It should have been something else, Obi-Wan had always thought. Evil should have been grand in a way that allowed contempt. But it was efficient. It was surgery that removed what it needed to remove and did not dwell on the ugliness of its work. Palpatine's blade found openings where there should not have been any. Obi-Wan closed one with a pivot so small it nearly tore his hip and the other with trust. He dove left because Anakin would be right. He lifted his blade because Anakin would keep his low. In the space between them they built a shape the Sith had not planned for. Not unity born of control, but survival born of willing surrender. The way they had flown together, the way they had once taught a Padawan to take the leap and trust hands would be there. Palpatine recognized it. He hissed like a cooling wire. His free hand jerked and the air turned to claws. Lightning sought bone. Obi-Wan's left shoulder exploded with pain. His teeth clamped together hard enough that his skull rang. He rolled, let the pain become force moving in another direction, and came up with blue light between the crackling storm and Anakin's face. Anakin didn't flinch. He took a step through the pain toward the source and cut at an angle that would have disarmed a less careful liar. The blade kissed fabric and drew less blood than a shaving cut. The smell that came off it was not human. Palpatine smiled with all his teeth. He moved his saber as if it was a pen and the air his page, inscribing a history he had already written. With a flick he shifted the fight toward the window, toward the wind that howled across the open mouth of the office. Somewhere beyond the doorway, a voice shouted into a comm the Chancellor had pressed a panic code or the Senate guard had recognized that the theater had spilled real fire into the expensive carpets. "They will come," Palpatine murmured, conversational under the clash. "And the Senate will see. They will see the order for what it is. They will thank me for saving them." "You mistake gratitude for exhaustion," Obi-Wan said, barely above breath. He slid in under a blow and brought his saber up. The posture was from a syllable in the language of Form 3. He hadn't used it this way since Geonosis. This time he wasn't trying to hold off a sea of blades. He was trying to answer one with patience. "And you mistake fear for wisdom." A ripple ran through the Force like a flood changing banks. Palpatine's eyes snapped toward Anakin in that instant. He had felt it too. A set of emergency codes powering up on the Chancellor's desk, a relay clicking into readiness, a hidden channel schooling itself like a snake preparing to strike across the galaxy. "No," Anakin said. The word was quiet and final and filled with the sound of a boy who had once said he hated sand because it got into everything and marked living where he was now living. He reached out and closed his hand on the channel, not literally, but with the same certainty of ownership, and crushed. Circuits sparked. The relay screamed a small, brief scream as it died. Smoke rose from the desk in lazy threads. "Petulant," Palpatine said, and the speed surged. Obi-Wan had been trained for speed. He had fought the galaxy to a draw with it and then taught himself the value of refusing its terms. He bent to it now because there is a wisdom in learning how the enemy's blade writes. He gave ground to stay in line with Anakin, always making sure their orbit caught and held. The Chancellor's saber blurred, a red argument written across blue pages. Anakin answered with a grammar that was elegance when he wanted it to be and savage when he needed it. Heat lifted from their blades and made the air ripple, turning the room in moments to a kiln. They drove Palpatine back toward the shattered windows. His heel met glass. Light dragged over his face, changing him with every flicker. For a breath, Obi-Wan saw the man he had greeted after council sessions, the patient listener who had said all the right things about compromise and how peace did not arrive in one piece but in fragments, collected and respected. Then the light changed and the mask was gone again, and what stood before them was hunger wearing a robe. Palpatine leapt. He cleared them with a flip that had nothing of age in it and landed behind them, closer to the internal door. He thrust out his hand. The door clanged shut. Locks clattered home in quick succession. A dozen guardsmen rushed in anyway, shockpike tips spitting crackling arcs. The room's light flickered under the sudden play of electricity. "Do not kill them," Obi-Wan said, because they were soldiers and not the enemy, even as he swept one pike aside and sent its wielder spinning into a chair with a push of the Force that promised a bruise and not a funeral. Anakin moved like he had been born in the reach between speed and mercy, disarming another and stepping under a blow to break the shaft cleanly over his knee. A third lunged and found a hand emptying the pike with a twist, then landing on the floor with his breath knocked out, blinking up at the ceiling so hard his helmet would scuff. Palpatine used the moment. He slid to the desk and slapped his palm down on a secondary panel hidden beneath the wood. Obi-Wan hadn't known it was there. The desk hummed. Somewhere in the guts of the building, an uplink tried to breathe. Anakin was there like light answering itself. He drove his saber straight through the panel. Something popped with a sound that made the back of Obi-Wan's mouth taste like blood. Fire licked around metal. The desk sagged in the middle and gave up being a desk. Palpatine's right eye twitched. It was the smallest crack. In that tiny fault line, Obi-Wan saw a choice. Flee into the city and call the Senate to witness a lie, or pour himself into the fight that would decide whose story survived this night. "You taught me that winning often looks like waiting," Obi-Wan said under his breath. Anakin nodded once. Wind dragged across the floor, ran about their boots like a curious hound, and fled back out into the night. They pressed him. Palpatine retreated up the shallow steps near the side alcove toward his private balcony. His saber moving not like a sword now but like a lash. Lightning rained. It arced across Obi-Wan's blade and crawled along the veins in the marble, seeking a ground. He could smell his own skin heating. His left hand went numb to the elbow. He tucked it into his robe for a beat as if it had always belonged there. His right kept the blue line exactly where it needed to be to keep Anakin's head where it belonged. Anakin slid in low and then high in a combination that would have looked like showing off if anyone else had done it. Palpatine met him with a crackle of red and their blades locked for a heartbeat. Light beating against light. "Look at you," Palpatine breathed to Anakin, their faces an arm's length apart. "Look at the beauty of what you could be if you'd remove that dead weight." Anakin's eyes were very steady. "He carried me farther than you ever could." Palpatine's mouth curled in a sad smile. "Then die together." He drove a storm through the air. It hit Obi-Wan in the chest. For a beat his heart forgot its job. He stumbled, breath gone, and went to one knee instead of the floor because he had been taught that falling wasn't always the same distance. Anakin took a step between him and the storm because he had been taught that also. Their blades crossed in a bright X. The storm ran along that sign and broke apart, raging at the edges of the room instead of at its center. Something like laughter threaded through the crackle. It had no humor at all. Obi-Wan stood. He ignored the way the world tilted for a second, ignored the needle jabs of light running up his arm, ignored the taste of smoke in his throat. He breathed in and let everything that was not useful at this instant go. The Force was not a voice, but it was a tone, and under the shrieking of the storm he found it. The sound a comet makes when it has decided the shape of its fall. He looked at Anakin and saw the same recognition there, the same acceptance of cooperation. "On my mark," he murmured. Anakin's mouth twitched, feral and happy. A boy about to jump a canyon with a swoop bike he should not be riding. "Your mark." Obi-Wan fainted high and then slid his saber down along Palpatine's in a spiral that stole momentum where it was gathered. Anakin stepped in at the exact half-second when the red blade had to choose, and he struck not with his blade but with the Force, straight into the Chancellor's center. Palpatine's breath left him in a small ugh of surprise. The spiral closed. Obi-Wan's saber carved across the hilt of Palpatine's, not a full strike. He did not need to sever, just enough to make a small, fussy change in balance. The red blade flickered. It dropped a fraction. "Now," Obi-Wan said, and Anakin rode the opening into the cut he had been waiting to make since he walked back into the room. It was a small wound, low across Palpatine's thigh where robes would hide it. But it took something they needed, a fraction of speed, the kind that separates the predator from the cornered. Palpatine hissed like a coil biting skin. He moved, and this time the movement was a fraction slower. Sirens sang somewhere in the corridors outside. The Senate guard pounded on the door. It would not hold much longer. "You think you've won," Palpatine said through his teeth. "You think the galaxy changes its mind because you strike me once. You have no notion of how deep I have dug my wells." He angled his body. "You have wives to lie to, children to hide. A temple rotting from its foundation on a shrine your forebears were too proud to destroy. Walk the halls and see how the dark you fear whispers through the stone." The word shrine scraped bone. Obi-Wan didn't let it show. He knew the stories of the temple's ground. The council had kept the oldest truths in the quiet places behind their eyes, and still the truth had waited patiently under their feet. That failure was an old ache. He could not fix it here. He could only end this. The door blew inward with a blast that staggered the guards as much as the room's occupants. Smoke stumbled in first. Men followed, eyes wide behind visors, pikes leveled. Among them strode Commander Fox, the red of his Coruscant Guard armor catching the lights. His blaster lifted directly toward the two Jedi. "Stand down," Obi-Wan said sharply. He did not look away from Palpatine. He could not. "By authority of the High Council, you will lower your weapons." Fox hesitated. Protocol warred with instinct. Then Palpatine's voice, slick as oil, went past them all. "Commander, arrest these traitors." The word traitors bounced off the walls and tried to make itself a truth. Anakin turned his head slightly, keeping most of his attention where it needed to be. "Commander," he said in a voice that had ordered the 501st through hell and back and been obeyed because his soldiers loved him in the way men love the hand that lifts them. "You know me. Lower your weapons." Fox's visor flicked a fraction toward the Chancellor and back. His blaster did not waver. The moment stretched. In it, Obi-Wan heard 100 other battlefields where decisions had compacted themselves into less than a breath. Then Fox made a decision and the blaster angle dipped a degree. He had not lowered it, but he had not fired either. "Chancellor," he said, and even through the vocoder Obi-Wan could hear that the commander was speaking very carefully. "I require clarity on the chain of command. My orders are to protect the Senate and the Chancellery. The Jedi are traitors," Palpatine snapped, and the word carried the kind of weight that made men bend whether they believed it or not. "Chancellor," Anakin said, and he gave the title a shape it had not had lately, the shape of the office rather than the man who wore it. "Stop." It landed with more force than Obi-Wan could have managed because it came from love that had turned its face toward truth. Palpatine's lips flattened. The facade of grandfatherly patience shattered like cheap glass. What looked back at them now was the wound that had learned to speak. "Have it your way." He raised both hands and the storm he had been rationing broke. Obi-Wan had a half-second to cross in front of Anakin and plant his feet. The lightning hit him like a wall. It tried to drive him backward to the windows and out into the night. He bent like a tree that refuses to give up its roots. He could smell the hair on his wrist singe. Anakin's blade slid in beside his. The X formed again, the storm catching on its edges. The Senate guardsmen staggered back under the backwash, pikes going down because hands couldn't make them stay up. Obi-Wan had learned a long time ago that there were times the Force felt like a friend and times it felt like a teacher. This felt like a tide that did not care who you were. He released everything into it that he could not control. The fear of failure that had crouched behind him since Qui-Gon's body cooled on the Theed hangar floor, the anger at the Council's mistakes, the grief at a war made by men who poured children into it and called that necessary. He let the tide take those pieces and found what remained in his hands when it had gone. A blade, a breath, and the man beside him. "Now!" he shouted. Not at Anakin but at Fox and the guards. "Now, you fools! The traitor is the one trying to kill you." Fox did not need telling twice. His blaster snapped up and fired. Not at Anakin, not at Obi-Wan, but at the control box that hung above the balcony. The panel blew. A blast shield stuttered and dropped halfway, then, under the emergency failover, slammed all the way down. It caught the edge of the storm and cut it in half. Palpatine snarled. The room's lights exploded and the crackle of lightning became a frantic scurry, seeking exits that no longer existed. Anakin moved through the sudden darkness like a man who knows where the furniture is. He vaulted the wreck of the desk, found Palpatine by heat before light returned, and took his arm at the wrist with a cut that marked itself on the bones of the night. The red blade fell, clattered to the floor with an ugly sound. Palpatine screamed. A sound that reached for helplessness and found fury instead, and the room filled with a shove of force that staggered them all. Light returned in fits. Fox's men recovered, pikes coming back up, arcs of energy dancing like angry insects. Their target stood hunched and breathing hard. His face sagged into a map of years that did not match what the public had been allowed to see. He lifted his remaining hand. Lightning crawled along his fingers, reluctant and eager both. Obi-Wan stepped into it. He let his saber drink it. His hands trembled. His teeth hurt. He took it anyway. Anakin did not strike the killing blow. He did something harder. He reached past the light and the old man inside it with the Force and wrapped it around Palpatine like a harness on a savage animal. Not to be cruel, but to restrain the worst of a language the man had taught himself to love. He held. Obi-Wan held. Between them they made a cage for power and brought it to the floor. Palpatine sagged inside that restraint. He looked up at Anakin and smiled around his pain. A soft, gruesome expression that almost managed to look fatherly. "You will regret this," he whispered, each word pulled over gravel. "When her breath fails. When the nursery is a tomb. When you realize what I offered and what you spurned." Anakin held his gaze and said nothing. It was the finest refusal he had ever made. They put him in cuffs. Fox looked at the cuffs and did not ask what material resisted the force or whether any such material existed. He simply doubled the number and added 2 sets of shock binders and 4 men with pikes and the quiet, implacable decision to shoot the most important man in the Republic if he twitched wrong. The door became a crater of bent metal as the Senate guard hauled it all the way open. The corridor beyond had filled with men who had trained their entire lives never to allow breach here. Now they looked at their prize and did not know what to do with him. "Take him to a secure holding cell," Obi-Wan said. His voice peeled threads from the silence and rewove them. He turned to Fox. "No comms in or out except by my authority or that of the Council. You will not take orders from any other source." Fox's visor tilted a fraction, then nodded. "Understood, General." Obi-Wan turned toward Anakin. For a moment they just looked at each other, 2 men who had run through fire and found themselves still standing. Then Anakin's mouth twitched again and he blew out a breath that might have been a laugh if he hadn't been shaking. "That went better than I expected," he said. Obi-Wan discovered that his knees had opinions. He declined to consult them. "Let's make sure the rest of the night doesn't." The night did not yield easily. They moved quickly because standing still would let the story catch up and fix them in its favored narrative. Obi-Wan combed the temple and found static. He combed Master Yoda and got a thin, harsh buzz like a line severed. He reached for Master Plo Koon and found space answering instead of a friend. Panic tugged, a small vindictive creature with metal teeth. He set it on the floor and stepped away. "The uplinks," he said. "We need to sever any crown channel he might have seeded. We stopped the broadcast here, but if he had redundancies..." He didn't finish the sentence. Anakin was already at the ruined desk, shoving the wreckage aside with his boot and tearing out charred panels with his bare hands. He grabbed a cable and yanked. A hidden compartment popped. A tight, elegant grid of humming nodes peered back at him like the underside of a spider. "Redundancies," he said dryly, and drove his saber through the grid in 3 quick cuts. The hum collapsed like a stage set. "Apo will have the 501st in staging," he added, voice tightening on habit. "Fox will have the guard locking down the Senate sector. If we move now, we can put the temple on warning and evacuate the creche before anyone gets spooked enough to do something stupid." "Go," Obi-Wan said. "I'll reach Bail." Anakin hesitated. The hesitation was new. It wore the face of a simple question that had always had a simple answer until tonight. He found the answer anyway. "Together," he said, and Obi-Wan nodded. They moved through corridors filled with men who knew how to look everywhere at once. Some saluted Anakin automatically and then stopped mid-motion when they saw Obi-Wan and recalculated what officers in the same place meant. Some stared at Palpatine's office door, at the blown metal and the smell of smoke drifting out, and decided that the story would be told later and that for now their job was to not be a part of it. They took a service lift down to a level where traffic was permitted to those with permanent clearances and polite scowls. Outside, the city's hum pressed against their ears like the hand of a thinking creature. Bail Organa answered his comm on the second signal. His face filled the small holoproj, lined with fatigue that had not yet found a bed. "Master Kenobi," he began, and then his gaze flicked and widened. "Anakin." "Senator," Anakin said. He looked as if he were about to apologize for disrupting a schedule, and then remembered there was no schedule older than this. He straightened. "We've arrested the Chancellor. There are men who carry poise like a cup they can set down when both hands are needed." Bail set his cup down without spilling. "On what grounds?" he said, each word clear and careful. "And how long do we have before the Senate starts tearing itself apart?" "On the grounds that he is the Sith Lord we've been chasing since we were children," Obi-Wan said grimly. "And we have as long as it takes for his allies to locate their feet. We need the temple secured and the Senate informed while we can still shape the sentence." Bail's carefully controlled expression broke long enough to show fear. "There are rumors of an order," We stopped the broadcast at source, Anakin said. But redundancies exist. We need to assume any unit with a direct line to his office could receive a targeted command. Keep your staff off the crown channels. If you have any link to Mon Mothma, tell her to do the same. And he glanced toward the skyline, toward one particular tower that had shaped them all. And pray. Bail inclined his head once, as if someone at the far end of a very long table had spoken the only wise thing for hours. I'll meet you at the temple, he said, and cut the connection before either of them could thank him. The temple rose like a mountain the city had built to remind itself what it was for. At its crown the council spires pricked the night. As they approached in a commandeered speeder, Obi-Wan felt the force collect around the complex like weather deciding what it wanted. In the hangar bay they found clones in blue-striped armor moving with the functional precision of men who had been told to assemble and had not yet been told to attack. Appo stood at the forefront, posture uncompromising as the plate across his chest. His helmet was off. His face was young and tired and the sort of handsome that often did not live long. General Skywalker, he said when Anakin leapt from the speeder. His gaze flicked to Obi-Wan and back. We received a priority alert and then static. We've been awaiting your order. Anakin's body remembered the ease of command even as his soul fled it. He did not show the flinch. There is no order from the Chancellor, he said. The Chancellor is under arrest on charges of treason and murder. You will stand down and accept directives from the Council. Appo's eyes narrowed. The word treason launched toward his training and found fertile ground. The word Council anchored it. He saluted. Standing down, sir. Obi-Wan turned to the temple's entryway and felt the old stones hum under his feet. He had been 10 the first time he came through these doors, hand clamped in Qui-Gon's robe, eyes refusing to admit what they had never seen because to do so would be to admit that life had nothing more to offer. He had been 25 when Qui-Gon died and he promised a burning promise over the cooling body. He had been older than any of those ages for years now. He moved through the doors as if he were carrying a child that should not be dropped. Inside, the night had lost its certainty. Shadows fell in directions they usually did not fall. The creche was quiet because the Minders were disciplined. The children slept in rooms that smelled of clean linen and the small, stubborn breath of those who had not yet learned what vows could cost. Anakin moved ahead of him into that room. The tiny presences turned toward him in sleep as flowers turn toward light. He closed his eyes and stood in that doorway with a hand on the frame and did not cry because there was not time yet for that. It would come and it would drown him if he let it. He could not. Masters, said a voice at his elbow, and he turned to find a small boy with hair cropped close and a curiosity that could not be filed back. The boy peered up at Anakin and then at Obi-Wan with unabashed trust. Are we safe? Obi-Wan crouched. It hurt to do so, he did it anyway. You are, he said, and put into it the kind of certainty a world could stand on. The council chamber was not empty. Master Shak Ti stood at its center, her leku falling like banner cords along her shoulders. She looked like a statue of resolve and like a woman who had not slept in days. Beside her sat Masters Coleman Kaj and Stas Ali, both regarding the night with the same combination of disbelief and ready action that had characterized their species since they learned they were not alone. Holograms flickered in the remaining seats, some dissolving repeatedly into snow as their ships or camps struggled to maintain a signal. Masters, Obi-Wan said. He bowed. Shak Ti's gaze raked him and found what she needed to see. Report. Obi-Wan gave the shortest version that told the truth. The Chancellor revealed as Sith. The fight in the office. The arrest, the foiled broadcast. He did not say Mace's name and then found that the omission weighed more than its inclusion. Master Windu is dead, he said, and the words went quietly to the center of the room and the room changed around them. Masters Fisto, Kohler, Tyan as well. The holos quieted further. For a breath, the only sound was the weather on foreign worlds. Then Shak Ti closed her eyes and bowed her head. When she lifted it, her voice was the voice of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing and could not put it down yet. We will mourn when we can afford to, For now, we must keep what can be kept. She looked to Anakin. Knight Skywalker, your place is unusual. Anakin accepted that without flinching. His chin came up a fraction. I am where I should be, Master. I won't ask forgiveness. I'll do the work. Good, Shakti said simply. She turned to the holograms. Masters, cut all crown channels. Use only temple encryption. Recall what forces you can without alerting local garrisons. We will draw our people home as if we were gathering a hymn. Quietly, if the Senate demands a statement, they can have a line. The Order is conducting an internal review and will release findings when appropriate. A thin, wry line warmed her mouth. Senators understand those words better than we should. Obi-Wan stepped to the window and looked out across the city. He had spent his life defending and sometimes gently opposing. Far below, a speeder cut a bright line between towers and vanished into the dark. The Force laid a map across his mind with small pins at all the places that could still break. The works district glowed like a banked coal, old industrial bones and older secrets. Under the temple itself, a smear of darkness sat with the patience of a tomb. Palpatine's words about foundations and shrines did not lie. The Order had pruned branches and ignored roots. Part of leadership is acknowledging what one has refused to see. Anakin, he said. Anakin came to stand beside him. He did not touch because some distances do not need closing. We should go to the works, he said, thinking along the same line of stone. If he had redundancies, they'll be there. Contact. Records. He told Dooku to meet him there for years. And Mustafar, the word tasted of ash. He would have sent the Separatist Council somewhere safe when Grievous fell. If we can find where, we end the war, Obi-Wan finished. The right way, Anakin echoed. His gaze slid to the reflection of the temple behind the window as if catching his own eyes through a trick of glass. I need to see Padme first, he said, and his mouth softened briefly around the name. If he tries to reach her, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Go, Obi-Wan said. I will meet you at the works. Anakin hesitated again and then leaned in just enough that their shoulders almost touched. Thank you, he said in a voice that belonged to a boy on Tatooine and to the man he had been trying to be for years, for not leaving me at the edge. I should have said it sooner, Obi-Wan replied. You were never a weight I had to carry. You were the ground that let me stand. He watched Anakin go. When the doors closed, the chamber seemed older, the stones remembering echoes of arguments that had taken place within them. Shakti's eyes were on him again when he turned back. You have made a choice, she said. So have we all, Obi-Wan answered. We will answer to the code for it later. For now, we answer to the living. She nodded. Go, she said, with what passed for a smile in a night like this. May the Force shadow you from those who would misuse it. The Works district breathed smoke and old anger. It had been built in a time when Coruscant still believed in a visible middle, places where people made things and then went home with hands as clean as they allowed them to be. Now it sounded like a sick animal. Towers kept breathing because the city demanded breath. Under those towers lay levels no one had bothered to light properly for a generation, because light reveals what it reveals and budgets are stories told to different audiences. Obi-Wan moved along catwalks that had been welded by men who had friends waiting for them after shift. He felt the Force gather itself in the cracks and in the thick oil on the maintenance rails. Memory lives in matter. It does not need permission. He let his awareness move like damp rising. In it, he found a door that no architect had marked. He palmed it. It did not open. He set his hand more deliberately. Stone remembered and grudgingly parted. Beyond the door lay a room that could have been anywhere. A table, a chair, an array of hollow projectors sleeping like predatory animals on a log. Against one wall, a half-sphere of polished black. It absorbed light with delicate greed. The air in the room had a taste that reminded him sharply of places where the Order had told Padawans to avoid study at certain hours. He stepped in, and the floor said his name softly, once, in a voice all stone speaks. He crossed to the hollow grid. His fingers danced on controls and woke the animals. Flat blue light rose like fog. Logs scrolled, meetings at odd hours, dance steps of power disguised as compromise. Dooku's face materialized once, stern and tired and resolved to things he had decided needed doing. Sifo-Dyas flickered and died. The recording corrupted or cut. Other faces ghosted past. Bankers, leaders of trade guilds, men who had bought their seats on committees and men who had been born on them. Finally, a set of codes that were not faces at all but the skeleton of a plan. He traced them with the Force and found Mustafar's signature tucked inside. "Of course," he murmured. "Lava fascinates men who think themselves immune to heat." He sent the data to the temple in a packet wrapped with his own signature and the subtlest encryption he could give it, the sort that looked like bad handwriting and therefore escaped the default translation programs in use by the sloppy. He turned to the half-sphere. The dark glass returned only his own face for a moment and then, very briefly, a gentleman with careful hair and black tattoos like writing across his cheeks, eyes hungry above them. The image flickered and went. Another story, another night. Footfalls approached from the corridor outside. He turned with his saber already in his hand because habits keep men alive. A figure appeared in the doorway, hands slightly raised. "Easy," Bale said, and managed to make easy sound like something a senator could do. "Your preference for stairs over lifts is the only reason I found you and not the other way around. Some of us still read the old maintenance maps." He smiled without humor. "Did you find what we need?" "Enough," Obi-Wan said. He told him about Mustafar. Bale's mouth flattened. "I need a ship," Obi-Wan added. "Something small and unremarkable." "Done," Bale said, because he was the kind of man who got things done before people asked. Mon is keeping the Senate occupied with procedural questions that will take 3 hours to answer. Masameda is sweating like a man who has placed a bet and cannot find the ticket. Sly Moore has evaporated. Fox's men have the Chancellor in a cell so deep we had to invent a metaphor to find it. Obi-Wan didn't smile. He felt the Force take a breath. "We will need a tribunal that can hold its nerve," he said. "And we will need to prepare for the truth to be unwelcome in rooms that consider themselves refined." He glanced at the half-sphere. "And we will need a new foundation for the order built on a humble sentence. We were wrong about some things." Bale's eyes softened. "The sentence will do more good than you think." He clapped a hand lightly to Obi-Wan's shoulder. "Go. End the war." Obi-Wan met Anakin on a rooftop where wind moved cleanly and the flight lanes flowed like a river that had decided it was truth. Anakin's cloak snapped. His hair had come loose again. His face looked as if he had been miles and years. He held a hand out. Inside it lay a small charm carved of dark wood. A Naboo talisman shaped like a stylized starbird. "From her," he said, and for once he did not attempt to put words around the rest. "She is safe. For now." "For now," Obi-Wan repeated, because the night did not allow larger promises. They moved together to the waiting ship, a long-nosed courier craft whose lines wanted to be invisible. The hatch hissed. The cockpit welcomed them with the honest glow of dials and the lavender hum of systems ready to be told what they were for. Obi-Wan took the pilot's chair without ceremony. Anakin slid into the co-pilot's seat like one of the older constellations taking his place in the sky without needing the map. They left Coruscant without saying goodbye. The city fell away behind them, its skin of lights hiding deeper skin of the kind Palpatine had talked about with such smug confidence. The stars opened in front of them, cold and promising. Hyperspace took them the way the ocean takes a boat when a man who can read water grins and pushes off from shore. Mustafar rose from that sea like a wound that never scabbed. Fire breathed in its vents. Ash made a sky's worth of lies about what could be walked on. The administrative complex perched on a narrow spit of cooled stone like a crab that had learned to count. Their ship slid toward it low, using the heated air as cover. Sensors pinged. Anakin pinged back with codes he had no right to possess and which the droids accepted because machines are faithful in a way men find uncomfortable. In the wide conference room at the heart of the complex, leaders of the Separatist Council argued with one another in voices that had not been designed for truth. Newt Gunray pointed with the hand holding a pen, as if the pen meant he was writing history instead of just signing checks. Sandhill looked gray in a way that had nothing to do with his species. What Tambor's modulator stuttered on a syllable and caught, producing a miniature storm of consonants. Around them, B-1 droids held their rifles at the kind of parade rest that droids enjoy because it does not hurt their knees. A hollow node pulsed in the center of the table, waiting for orders that would not come from the voice they had expected. The door opened. 2 men in brown stepped in like farmhands who had learned a more dangerous trade. The droids turned their heads. Their processors misfired for a fraction of a second as reality encountered a line their instructions did not include. In that fraction, Obi-Wan lifted a hand and also a truth. "Stand down," he said. The droids did. The council did not. "You cannot be here," Newt Gunray sputtered. "This facility is under arrest," Anakin said, tired. "As are you." He stepped to the edge of the table, and in the light from the lava rivers his scars, not on his skin, but those cut into bone and breath, showed in a relief that made them both look like statues carved by a hand that respected grief. "You played a game you thought would make you saints of your own cause. You lost. We're going to end this." "On whose authority?" Sandhill said, words bitter enough to scuff metal. "On the authority of lives too numerous to count," Obi-Wan said. He inclined his head toward the hollow node. "Your armies rely on a signal they believe they control. They do not. We will transmit the code that severs their spines. They will lie down like harmless skeletons. You will answer for what you have done in a room with chairs. You cannot." What Tambor buzzed, fear making his modulator add harmonics, he would have been embarrassed to hear on a recording. You'll be alive," Anakin said flatly. He touched the hollow node. Codes unspooled, a weaving that looked like art and acted like a weapon. Mustafar's heat pressed against their faces. The room smelled briefly of hot plastic and fear. "Count yourselves lucky." The code went out. Across the galaxy, B-1s froze with their rifles raised in the air, as if an artist had decided statues should help hold up the map of the war. B-2s shuddered and sank to their knees like actors at the end of a bad production. Tri-droids spun in slow circles, lost, and then folded their legs in a precise and oddly elegant series. Battle tanks hummed down. The war stopped breathing. Obi-Wan did not feel triumph. He felt something like the first breath after a fever. He reached for the Force and found it muttering to itself, counting losses and not bothering to pretend it was a tally a man could hold in his head. He said the names of masters loudly in his mind, a quiet liturgy for the fallen. Windu, Fisto, Kohler, Tyan. Others would be added before dawn found Coruscant again. Perhaps there was a logic greater than the one they had bent tonight. Perhaps not. He was too tired to feed that fire. They took the council into custody and did not march them past droids to a courtyard with drain channels. They put them in an armored transport and did not look at their faces because there is a kind of pity that eats important parts first. They rose from Mustafar on thrusters that were glad to leave and re-entered the quiet tunnel of hyperspace, placing between themselves and that awful red land a set of lines designed to say we went and we came back and we will not go again if we can help it. On the far side, the galaxy waited like a room where a child had dropped a bowl of water and was trying to decide whether to sob or laugh at the mess. News traveled faster than ships. Rumor faster still. The Senate had not voted itself an empire in the hours since. It had shouted, and then fallen to arguing about procedure, and then shouted again. Mas Amedda had stood entirely too quietly and had not, at any point, made a move to reclaim the Chancellor's office. Sly Moore remained missing. Fox's men had rotated shifts and invented a new form of boredom called not looking at their prisoner. Palpatine had sat in a cell where the light did not fully do as it was told and had smiled at his hands. Padme waited on a balcony where Coruscant's fake wind did as it was told. The city lay beneath the curve of her hand as she traced the path her thoughts kept drawing of their own accord. When the ship shrank from a speck to a shape, she exhaled hard enough to make the world tilt. When Anakin's boots touched the floor and he came through the door in one piece and every piece his, she made a sound that did not belong to senators or to queens. He caught her and folded her as if she were the map he had been using all night. Her hair smelled like some Naboo flower that had stubbornly refused extinction despite how often the world had tried to design beauty out of its economies. "We did it," he said into her hair. "For now." She leaned back enough to look at him, and the tears in her eyes were laughing because bodies contain two truths at once. "For now," she agreed. Her hands came to his face. "Your eyes are yours again. They were always mine," he said. "I just forgot who had the right to look out of them." She glanced over his shoulder. Obi-Wan stood inside the threshold, as if the doorway were a place a man could respect by not walking through it without permission. She held her hand out. He came forward and took it. She squeezed hard enough to tell him the bones of her fingers, and he did not flinch because pain often feels like a chain gratefully accepted. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't do it for thanks," he replied. "But I'll take it anyway." They went back to the temple because the temple was more than a building and could not be abandoned to its stones. The council convened in daylight that felt dishonest after a night like that. Masters who had survived stood in their chairs in various states of shell-shock. The holos filled with faces that had not died because the broadcast had not gone out, because men had moved when they did, because the world had bent this once to the side of mercy. Plo Koon's hollow flickered to life, his mask hiding a grief that did not need a mouth to be seen. Aayla Secura stood in jungle light with her head bare and the streak of a near miss on her shoulder. She lifted a hand in cautious salute. Ki-Adi-Mundi spoke and did not sound like himself because he had been less wrong this time than he might have been. Shak-Ti stood in the center and spoke the sentence that had been making itself in Obi-Wan's head since dawn. "We were wrong about some things," she said, and her voice wore dignity like a practical shawl instead of a jeweled cape. "We were wrong to believe that denial is purity. We were wrong to think that vigilance alone is wisdom. We will change." Mon Mothma stood before the Senate with her hair pulled back severely and told the truth as if she were peeling it from the bottom of a pan where it had been stuck for too long. Bail stood beside her. Some senators believed them because they wanted to. Some because the evidence Obi-Wan had taken from the works landed on their desks like exotic birds and refused to be ignored. Some did not. There were calls for tribunals and calls for pardons and calls for new elections and calls for old names to be kept because change makes men nervous. In a cell beneath all of that, Palpatine sat with his hands folded and tried the weight of a world where his plan had reached for a lever and found nothing but air. He did not rage. He did not need to. Rage wastes sea. Allery's one might need later. He smiled. He had dug wells very deep. Above him, men bickered in rooms with high ceilings and women wrote laws that would not entirely do as they were told. This too was a plan he knew how to manipulate. He closed his eyes and spoke sentences that would reach the ears of men he still owned. Meanwhile, he waited to see whether his chosen apprentice stayed where he had been placed in the cage or whether sentiment proved a stronger bar. Obi-Wan had thought sleep might claim him like a wave claims a man who stops fighting it. It did not. He sat in a small meditation room with a window that looked toward a world that seemed younger when observed at a distance. His left arm throbbed in time with the bandaged burns. His chest ached where lightning's fingers had combed along his bones. The force settled around him like cool cloth on a fevered brow. It did not chase the fever entirely. Fevers exist for reasons a body sometimes needs to respect. He folded himself into quiet. For a while that quiet took on the shape of another voice, one he had not heard since Naboo in anything but memory. It was not a voice in the room. He did not see a shimmering form lean on the doorframe as Qui-Gon had been fond of doing. But memory was a force skill too. He heard his old master's laugh, quick and delighted at simple bravery. He saw sandstorm light on a face that had refused to be anything other than stubborn kindness. He said, "In his head and in his heart, you were right about more things than we wanted to admit, and I was right about more things than you wanted to, and between us we were very wrong about a boy and very right about him." The quiet folded that message away like a letter kept under a pillow. Anakin came and sat across from him without a word. They breathed together for a while, and the air decided not to be sharp anymore. When Anakin spoke at last, his voice was quieter than the city. "He was in my head for so long," he said. "He wore my fear like a ring. I keep reaching and finding only my own hand. It's strange. You'll have an itch for a while where the ring used to be, Obi-Wan said. And then one day you'll realize it hasn't itched in a week. He lifted an eyebrow. You will still be insufferable about flying. Anakin's mouth quirked. I deserve one vice. You have a wife. That seems vice enough for any one man. Anakin's laughter this time was not a man coming up from drowning. It was water finding its level. He sobered quickly. I spoke to the council, he said. About Padme. About the children. Shakti did not blink. She said the code is a boat we built for the sea we thought we were on. This is another ocean. We'll build better boats. Wisdom, Obi-Wan murmured. Hard one. He looked down at his burned hand and thought of all the things he had carried with it. A lightsaber, a friend's headstrong elbow, a Padawan's wrist when she had been about to do something wonderfully foolish. He set it palm up on his knee. What we did tonight will not save us from every storm, he said. Some storms are not willing to be saved from. But for now, we have bought time for truth and for children. Anakin's gaze drifted to the window and beyond it to the smallest of the temple towers, where a small golden light burned in a room where younglings learned to find their center by balancing on beams and by learning to fall without fear. For children, he echoed, and his voice took on a note so fierce the air around it seemed to harden into something that could be used as a tool. The following days did not behave like a victory parade. They lurched. The Senate argued itself hoarse and then passed measures they hadn't expected to pass because Mon and Bail used boredom like a crowbar. Tribunals formed with men who had once been content to let committees do the work and found themselves reading. The military stood at a loose attention while the crown channels were audited and found to be as worm-eaten as an old beam. Clone medics dug into their own skulls with cold hands and pulled out slivers that made them gag. Chips set into place years ago that hummed a thrumming harmony if one put them on a tray and listened. A word went out that said the order would pay for the surgeries for any clone who wanted them. The line outside the temple infirmary bent with the weight of men whose faces looked like boys who had finally been allowed to decide if they were tired. Palpatine sat in his cell and spoke to no one and everyone. There are men who can address a crowd with their eyes closed. He delivered speeches in his head, and they changed the minds of men who would not have thought themselves susceptible to suggestion. He used boredom as a crowbar also, and finding the door stuck, he called for other tools. In a Senate hearing room that had never seen anything more exciting than an agricultural subsidy forged one night and a fisheries policy drowning the next by accident, a guard fell asleep with his head on his crossed arms and did not notice a slight power dip in the lights. On level 7, a pressure door opened automatically and then decided that had been an error. In a maintenance crawlspace, a woman in gray pressed a small device against a pipe and then frowned when it failed to explode. She shook it as if it were misbehaving like a child, then tucked it into her sleeve and walked away. On a balcony on the west side of the temple, a boy dropped his training saber and watched it tumble toward the lower tiers and then caught it with a gasp using the force like a hand that remembered how to grasp. Obi-Wan slept for 3 hours, then 6. When he woke, he dreamed of water making patterns where it ran under bridges built by hand. He took a cup of tea to the balcony and drank it while the sun rose like a coin slipped out of a pocket and discovered in the seam of morning. He told himself that every dawn bought matters another fraction of necessary time. When the tribunal convened at last, Palpatine was brought in under a canopy of blue shields and looks. The room was filled with men who had once been very good at pretending they could forget improprieties they could not address. Now impropriety had grown teeth and asked to be fed. Palpatine's face wore the ruin he had used to great advantage before. Now it just looked old. He sat. He folded his hands. He listened to charges delivered in the dry old voice of law. He smiled when appropriate. He did not look at Anakin, which was its own kind of looking. Anakin sat behind Obi-Wan with his hands folded and his legs not jiggling because he had learned long ago how to make his body obey when necessary. Padme sat to his left with her hands on her stomach and a calm that would have been remarkable if he hadn't known how she built such buildings for a living. Bail stood at the dais with Mon and a handful of other senators who had let their ideals age into patience and not into bitterness. Outside the chamber, Fox's men lined the walls like a second, more honest grade of stone. Evidence was presented. Holos played, Dooku with his controller's quiet disdain, the accounts that moved money the way rivers move silt, the manufacturing orders, the votes coerced through private promises, the recording of a voice on a secure line with a timbre that was unmistakable offering securities in exchange for moral malleability. The room made sounds the way rooms do when truth is displayed on a fabric woven for comfort. Palpatine spoke in his own defense at last. His words were careful and leaned heavily on metaphors of storms and of rudders and of steering toward rocks only to avoid the larger reef. He admitted to meeting with men as one must if one is to govern more than one kind of person. He did not deny that he had spoken of powers ancient and to be feared. He simply embraced them as the kind of fear a man in high office must be willing to entertain in order to protect small lives. He did not say Sith. He did not have to. It had already been said for him. He simply left it lying on the floor like a toy someone had forgotten under the couch. "Your concern for power is touching," Obi-Wan said when asked to respond. He stood with his hands at his sides and felt the bandages tug at his skin. But the truth is simpler. Power is not a god to be placated with sacrifices. It is a tool that must be held with clean hands. You do not have them. Palpatine's eyes flicked to Anakin finally. Quick as a knife and no more personal. "He thinks clean is a condition that endures," he murmured. Ironic for the benefit of those who enjoy irony. How fortunate for him. The tribunal recessed. The senators went to eat in rooms where the food was good and the conversations were not. The guards rotated. The city moved. In a corridor that had not seen the footsteps of children because those were not allowed in this wing, Padme paused halfway down and pressed her hands to the wall and breathed. A ripple ran through her stomach. Two tiny boats shifting in their bay. Anakin put his hand over hers and felt the bump of heel or head push up against his palm and then roll away, as if embarrassed at being noticed. He looked at Obi-Wan with a joy he could not hide, and Obi-Wan felt something like forgiveness he had not thought was his to have make itself into a warm place in his chest. He studied the wall and the light and the floor and the way the air traveled in those halls as if they could teach him how to be ready for the world when it wanted to change shape again. Tried to, in small and in large ways. Sly Moore was found not dead but drained in a warehouse in the works, her pale eyes staring at nothing. Men whispered about a rival, about the Chancellor's inner circle eating its own tail, about the old truths that say a beast will gnaw a limb to slip a trap. Mas Amedda resigned to spend more time with his family and then found himself under investigation for a version of family that included several shell companies and a permalance with the banking clan. Apo submitted to surgery and woke without the humming in his skull that had been there so long he had thought it normal. He cried without dignity and then slept for 11 hours. In the temple, masters walked the halls in the hours one usually reserves for cleaning machines and remembered to look down. They found in the stones beneath the central dais a line of darker stone that had not been there when the temple was first laid. They marked it. They spoke of it aloud. They opened a room below a room below a room and discovered a space that hummed at a frequency they did not like. They lit it with ordinary work lamps. They did not bless it. They studied it and spoke in the council about ways to move the temple 1 inch at a time if necessary. The Order would learn not to build on lies again. Anakin stood in that room once with the lamps buzzing and the dark stone sulking under them and felt the edges of a coil of old pain. It did not touch him. He had a hand on his chest where a talisman warmed under his tunic. He thought about a sandstorm on a day so bright it had made him weep, about an old woman on Tatooine who had sold them water for less because she had known kindness when she saw it and decided to invest. He thought about Qui-Gon lying down and refusing to get up and about Obi-Wan getting up despite it. He turned and went to the creche where small voices learned to sing their numbers, and he listened to them for a long time. The tribunal concluded in an afternoon that had finally lost patience with dusk. Palpatine was convicted not of Sithdom, the law had no such tenet, but of manipulation of the war, of crimes against sentience, of theft, fraud, and of all the small, petty crimes that, when woven together, make a pattern large enough to cover a galaxy. He would not be executed. The Republic was not a beast that ate fallen gods to pretend it had become one. He would be held in a cell where light behaved itself and where men could come and look at what happens when a plan is interrupted. History would learn a new word for caution. The war ended. The army stood down. Ships returned to bays where industrious beings cleaned them with a pride that looked like affection. Children who had never known a morning without a war on the news learned the sound of breakfast when the only thing one had to fear was missing the bus. The temple opened its doors to those who wished to learn the simplest truths of the Force. That it moves through everything and that breathing with it makes the world marginally less stupid. Men who lived in the light bought inexpensive flowers and put them in small vases and looked foolish and delighted about it. Obi-Wan went to Naboo and stood on a hill where the grass bent under wind that did not have to be told what it was for. He visited a smooth domed building that smelled of fresh stone and candle smoke and left within it a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Eyes closed, a hand on a pillar. He thought of Qui-Gon and of all the mornings since he had wished for a voice that would tell him an answer he was fairly sure he knew and simply wanted confirmed. He opened his eyes and discovered that the world still required effort. He smiled. He went back to Coruscant. Padme gave birth in a room where the machines were quiet and the midwives spoke with attentive hands. Anakin held a small, slippery person and made a sound that had nothing to do with men or the Order or any of the words he had learned to wield. Obi-Wan stood at the window and watched the city bow its head because the light had decided for once to be tender. He turned when the first cry shook the room. He found his face wet. Anakin did not comment. Later, when there was less blood and more blankets and the air smelled like new skin and fear that had the good sense to morph into joy, Anakin said, "Luke," and later still, "Leia." And Padme kissed both names into the air. They slept like men who had decided for once to obey the body. They woke to feed a child. They walked the balcony with a baby breathing into the hollow of a neck. They learned that even those who can move mountains need to jiggle an infant exactly so. Time passed the way time passes when men stop trying to make it behave. The Order remapped itself, slowly and not without pain. Masters retired with dignity instead of clinging the way old ideas do when they do not notice that the chair has legs only as long as the room remains. New ranks were invented with less emphasis on height. A council sat sometimes on cushions on a floor in a circle and sometimes on chairs at a table, depending on whether those present wished to remember their hips or their posture. Attachments were not called sin or virtue. They were called what they are, which is responsibility one holds with both hands or not at all. A boy with a scar on his cheek who had once asked whether he was safe grew into a young man with a knack for machines and for listening to birds. A girl with a lisp that made her force into fourth became a knight and refused to fix the lisp because it made children laugh, and laughing at power is good practice. Anakin taught a class on piloting with an arrogance that had aged into accuracy. Obi-Wan taught a seminar on patience disguised as lightsaber forms and watched his students learn that Form 3 was a speech about how to stay standing when the room wants you to kneel. On a quiet evening in a courtyard where the air smelled of green and of light reflected off stone, Anakin turned to Obi-Wan and said, very simply, "We could have ruined everything." He watched children run along the paths and did not move to correct their form because there was time to walk, not just to arrive. I could have ruined everything. Obi-Wan considered the question as if it were a small mechanism that, if adjusted, might better show its clockwork. You nearly did, he said, the kindness in it larger for the lack of ornament. So did I, and for different reasons. But we did not. Anakin nodded. The part that frightens me is how easy it was to believe him when what he offered was exactly the shape of my fear. That is the only time any of us are experts, Obi-Wan said dryly, and Anakin laughed. We will not always be as clever as we were this time. We will make mistakes that are entirely new. But we told the truth, and we told it in time. Light caught in the temple stone and turned it briefly into mild fire. Wind moved through the grasses in the courtyard in long exhalations. Somewhere above them, a ship slid into a flight lane and found its place in the long, bright river. Somewhere below, a small hand reached for a bigger one and closed on it, and both learned again that chains are not only what men put on each other. Sometimes they are what men choose to hold because holding keeps them from floating where they cannot breathe. Years later, when stories had settled into their lives like cats finding favorite chairs, a young knight asked Obi-Wan whether he believed in destiny. They were in a room where books still had spines and still smelled like leather, because nostalgia is a manageable vice. Obi-Wan sipped his tea and thought about all the times he had chosen a door because he thought it was the only one and then learned there were others. He thought about a boy on Tatooine, about sand and sky and a reply that had turned out to be a handshake with history. He thought about a night in Coruscant when the air had tasted like copper and the city had leaned forward to see whether men were capable of an unusual kind of courage. "I believe in choices," he said at last, "and in the grace that sometimes holds us even when we pick the wrong ones. I believe in standing where the storm is and discovering that you are not alone there. The rest is a story we tell to make pattern where there was only kindness and luck." The knight nodded as if understanding and then went away to practice being the kind of person who learns. Obi-Wan watched him go. In the courtyard below, Anakin tossed his son into the air and caught him with a hoof and a laugh and a correction about footwork that could wait for another day. Leia scolded her uncle for not holding her higher. Padme sat on the bench and wrote notes for a speech about funding for refugee resettlement with a baby asleep against her thigh, her hand moving carefully so as not to disturb the tiny breath. Between the shadows of the pillars, the dark place under the temple muttered and then quieted. Stone had been replaced slowly, inch by inch, the way a body heals when one is patient and gives it what it needs. It would never be perfect. That was all right. Perfection is a statue's business. Living is messier and better. At night, when the traffic rivers sang and Coruscant's wind argued with the blinds, Obi-Wan would sometimes stand at the window and look out and think he could hear another voice laughing in the back of his head. He did not turn to look. He did not need to. He felt the thread that ran from him to Anakin vibrate sometimes with the ordinary thunder of family life. A cabinet door banging, a small cry, a fight about a tool misplaced, a late-night apology that sounded like the way grown men apologize when they are embarrassed and relieved. He felt the larger threads hum, Senate votes that mattered, a power station repaired before it failed, a new class of younglings learning that failure is a teacher and not a sentence. He breathed in. He breathed out. The Force breathed with him, the way a sleeping child breathes with a parent when both have given up the day. And when the old fear began to make its case, softly and eloquently, as it always will, he answered it with the only truth he had learned that mattered more than cleverness. Together. He would have smiled if it had been necessary, but the knight knew him well enough not to require such reassurances. Somewhere across the city, in a room where soft light made everything look possible, Anakin murmured to his children until they surrendered to sleep, and the guardian wind of Coruscant hurried on, pulling scraps of conversation and laughter into the morning it was already half building out of the night they had chosen, once not to let win. Commander Cody sat very straight on the edge of the infirmary cot with the posture of a man not accustomed to being the patient. The med droid's hands moved with a grace born of repetition, silver instruments glinting once in the cool light before disappearing beneath a sterile field. Lines read out in soft blue on a panel to Cody's right, pulse, oxygenation, neural chatter like the weather report of a brain. Obi-Wan stood beside him, robe sleeves pushed back from bandaged forearms, leaning his weight into the quiet. "It's smaller than you'd think," the med droid said, a professional's conversational murmur meant to anchor the living. "But very thoughtful." "Thoughtful," Cody repeated, as if testing whether the word could be trusted. "Sidious would be more accurate," Obi-Wan said mildly. Cody's mouth twitched. "You really did arrest him." "We did," Obi-Wan said, and let the plural sit between them like plain bread. "We stopped the broadcast here, but we can't assume none of the redundancies reached anyone. Better to remove the temptation." The droid's instrument chimed softly. Cody flinched. Obi-Wan set 2 fingers lightly on the commander's shoulder and felt the tension in him go from a high wire to a cable, flexible but sturdy. On the monitor, a thread of data spiked, shivered, settled. "Extraction complete," the droid reported. "Chip intact." It held up a sliver of glistening polymer and metal balanced on a tool's tip. It looked for all the world like a bead of rain caught in a spiderweb. For a heartbeat, Obi-Wan smelled ozone and old rain, the storm sense he had carried since the Chancellor's office. Cody looked at the thing that had lived in his skull since Kamino and blew out a breath that trembled once at the end. He had not asked many questions coming into this room. he asked one now, voice even. Did I try to kill you? Not yet, Obi-Wan said, and smiled because some jokes are the only way to look a truth in the face. And now, never. Cody's eyes flicked to the droid. Rex, CT-7567 is already on my list, the droid said crisply. The queue is long. You clones breed loyalty. Factory default, Cody said, and slid from the cot like a man reluctantly leaving cover. He gave Obi-Wan a straight look. We do what we're told, but we also decide who we are when the shouting stops. Obi-Wan inclined his head. Then help me teach the Senate to speak to you like men. Gladly, Cody said, and went to the door with his helmet under his arm. Posture loose now in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with ownership. The queue snaked along the temple's limestone hall like a quiet river. Blue-striped armor, sun-burnished cream, the gray mar of scuffed plates, helmets under arms, faces young and old in the particular way the Kaminoans had invented. Some talked softly. Some watched the light fall through the high windows with unreadable eyes. Jesse bumped Rex's shoulder with his own. Bly stared at the floor as if it might argue with him. Grease stood with his hands folded and a Wookiee trinket tied to his gauntlet. Rex saw Obi-Wan and straightened out of reflex, mask of rank snapping into place over the face of a man who had spent the last years unlearning how to be a number. General, Commander, Obi-Wan returned, and then shook his head. Fox used the word General Kenobi in a sentence an hour ago. I find I can accept it again for tonight. He nodded to the door. After the surgery, report to me in the council garden. Rex's mouth tipped. Copy that. Obi-Wan moved on through the hall. It smelled of antiseptic and metal polish and the warm, dry note the temple had always carried, like old paper that refuses to crumble. He climbed the stairs to the garden and found Shakti already there among the citrus trees, hands folded in her sleeves, Leku drifting over her shoulders like lines of thought. Wind worried the leaves. Beyond the wall, Coruscant murmured in that steady way she had, a city that did not stop to take attendance. Master Kenobi, Shakti said without looking up. Master, Obi-Wan replied. The queue grows. So does the work. She turned her head. In the light, her eyes were the brown of old wood. The Senate wants a scalp and a clean way to keep its own hands unbloodied. The Order wants absolution without the stations of humility. The clones want quiet. None of them will get exactly what they want. Good, Obi-Wan said. She smiled faintly. Ahsoka Tano has signaled from orbit, she added, the words placed down like a piece added to a careful construction. She requests permission to land. She carries news. And, it seems, a debt. Obi-Wan's breath lifted. The Force hummed a note of recognition. Have her come in through the east hangar, he said. Rex will want to meet her. An hour later, the east hangar filled with the sound of a familiar ship settling on her struts. The cruiser's hull still wore Mandalorian paint in places, an honor and an obligation. The ramp side down. Ahsoka Tano came into the light in worn boots and the kind of posture only earned by walking away and living long enough to question whether that had been the right choice. Her montrals caught the glow from above, casting stripes of shade along her shoulders. She glanced once at the temple's vault and at the banners hanging like stern elders in a hall, and then she saw Anakin where he stood at the foot of the ramp, motionless except for the hand he lifted as if he had forgotten for a heartbeat how to do anything else. They met halfway and then stopped, because some reunions are too big to hold and must be approached with care. Anakin's face worked around 3 or 4 words and settled on none. Ahsoka's mouth set and softened and finally broke into a smile that looked a little like the way dawn sneaks into the corners of a room. You look terrible, she said. You look like you can still beat me to a target, he returned. She laughed, and the hangar decided to keep breathing. Then she sobered faster than he did. Maul escaped, she said without ornament. We had him. The ship took a hit. He tore free and... She lifted a hand and let it fall. He's off the board. For now. Anakin nodded once. We'll see him again. We usually do, Ahsoka said dryly. Her gaze flicked to Obi-Wan and warmed. Master, welcome home, Obi-Wan said. because sometimes the right sentence is simple and has been waiting in the body for years. He glanced past her shoulder and caught a familiar set of blue jade eyes in the crowd at the ramp's base, helmet under his arm. Rex and Ahsoka saw each other then, and for a heartbeat the war ended in the way it ends in stories. Two people who have learned each other's breath finding it again. "Sir," Rex said. "Don't start," Ahsoka said, and stepped into his arms. He hugged her with care as if she were a piece of equipment with out-of-production parts, and then let his hands loosen because he remembered she was not a thing and never had been. "There are things we need to show you," Obi-Wan said when the hangar remembered being a place for work. "And there are things under our feet I would rather you not meet alone." Ahsoka's eyes sharpened. "The stories are true. Truer than we wanted them to be," Obi-Wan said. "We'll go in daylight, with friends." They descended at noon with lamps and courage. The passage under the temple did not care about light. It drank it. Anakin felt the stone's old mutter before his boot found the top step. Yoda had returned at dawn with Kashyyyk's wet green still on his robe's hem, the smell of Wookiee smoke clinging like a blessing. He moved now at the front with a gnarled stick that tapped the steps once for each beat of the heart. Behind came Shaak Ti, calm as a song one learns in childhood and hums without realizing it. Obi-Wan followed, bandaged hand tucked into his sleeve. Ahsoka ghosted along the wall like a marshal from a city with too many alleys. Rex and Cody brought up the rear with two temple guards who had been asked to take off their masks and had chosen to put them on anyway. The air tasted of metal and memory. At the first landing, Yoda paused. "Hear it, do you?" he asked without looking back. "The hum. It's under everything," Ahsoka said. "Like a vibration that refuses to dampen," Obi-Wan murmured. Anakin swallowed. The sound burrowed into the old places in him where fear had once built a nest and called itself prudent. He adjusted the strap on his gauntlet precisely to keep his hands from clenching. "It's angry. Hungry," Yoda corrected gently. "Anger, it learned. Hunger, it is." He tapped the stick twice. "Answer it we must. Not with a fight, with a filling." They reached the chamber. Once, long before the temple, this space had been a shrine. Before that, a crack in the planet's face where something had risen that men mistook for divinity. Now, stone lay smooth as a cauterized wound and just as unwilling to heal over. The dark half-sphere of glass that Obi-Wan had found in the works seemed an imitation of this, a toy made by a child aping an elder. Here, the curve of the wall accepted no reflection. It held light and offered nothing back. Rex and Cody stayed at the threshold. Their feet learned the measure of the room and decided not to anger it by coming nearer. Shaak Ti circled once as if measuring an opponent's reach. Ahsoka stood with her hands easy at her sides, shoulders loose, chin lifted, eyes smaller than she made them when she joked. Anakin and Obi-Wan stepped onto the central circle where the floor felt fractionally lower, as if hundreds of feet over hundreds of years had taught it that was the place to rest a body. "Sit," Yoda said, and did. The others followed. When all had settled, the old master spoke not in the teaching timbre of the council, but in the cadence he had used in the swamp when he had learned from voices without mouths. "Listen," he said simply. "Listen, and do not fear that what you hear must become you." They closed their eyes. The hum rose. For Anakin, it became a corridor lined with doors, each with a scent under it. The smell of burned metal, of childbirth, of Tatooine sand, of Coruscant at midnight when traffic is a river made of copper coins. One door exhaled the harsh, sterile chill of a medical ward, and he knew if he opened it, he would see Padme on a table with light far too bright and lungs that would not fill. He reached to tear the door off its hinges. "Let it speak," Obi-Wan's voice said from somewhere so close Anakin nearly reached out his hand. "You can say no without suffocating the sentence." Anakin took a breath that stuck halfway down and pushed it the rest of the way. He did not open that door. He did not run from it either. He listened to it as one listens to a drunk relative at dinner, attention without permission. For Obi-Wan, the hum turned into the hiss of a respirator and the crackle pop of lava as it skinned and blistered. He smelled a man burning as if the man were his own son. In the dark behind his eyes, he saw a figure in black like an answer to a question asked by a fool. He watched that figure walk up a ramp into a ship that would go places Obi-Wan never wished to go, and he felt grief reach for him with a lover's hands. He bowed his head and let it kiss his hair and then said very softly, "Not this time." Ahsoka heard the hum as tied against a cliff, and beneath it the voices of the younglings who had crowded her knees when she had come back to visit after leaving. She heard a thin, sharp cry at the moment of stopping that sounded very much like what a dying order would have made. She set her palms flat on the stone in front of her and said aloud, "We are not that brittle." Shakti heard the hum as the note a saw makes through bone, and beneath it the drone of policy argued in a room where none of the men had taken their armor off. She considered the sentence she had offered the council, "We were wrong about some things," and repeated it now, each word like a bowl set down on a table. Wrong about the shape of love. Wrong about the confidence of caution. Wrong about stone. She tasted each wrong and found under it a right worth keeping. Rex listened and heard the hum as a drop of liquid falling from a height into a container meant to be filled to the brim but never allowed to overflow. He heard the click of a chip. He heard the word obey spoken in a voice that belonged to a man who had become, against all odds and orders, his friend. He said, "No more," and thought of fives. Cody listened and heard the hum as marching boots at shift change, the rasp of fabric in a barracks when men rolled over in their bunks to tuck their hands under their heads in the old way they had learned because pillows were not designed for the men they became. He heard the word good soldier and the echo that followed it, which sounded like a laugh and a curse. Yoda listened and heard the hum as the breath of a creature that did not speak language as he knew it. He heard what the priestesses had shown him in the place beyond places. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, and he set that light down on the floor between his knees like a lantern. The hum turned, curious. Obi-Wan felt the change first. A shiver, then a sigh. He opened his eyes. The wall was still dark, but the shadow in the stone had pulled itself tight, like a muscle reluctant and then ready to uncramp. He reached out not with his hands but with the part of him that had knelt over Qui-Gon's body and promised something he had not understood. And he said into the old air, "We will not build on you without acknowledging that you were here first. The Force is larger than us. We are guests." The room exhaled. The hum softened. The dark curve drank, and for the first time in longer than human memory it offered back a thin, honest reflection. Men and women sitting with their spines straight and their hands unclenched. Something else moved with the change. It did not come from the stone. It came through it, as if a signal had been damped and now found the exact path of least resistance. It found a cell 100 meters below the Senate's east wing. Palpatine lifted his head and smiled around dry lips. "Ah," he said to the light, voice like paper. "There you are, across the city, in a warehouse that hid the work of men who preferred to do their work in other men's names." A blade snapped to life. Crimson, a roar and a purr. The man who held it wore careful hair and ink on his face. He moved like a knife sliding home. Maul felt the change under the temple and understood nothing beyond this. An opportunity. He turned and spoke through a chain of hands that did not know who he was. In the cell, power dipped for a heartbeat as a hidden circuit tried to wake. Fox had posted double guards at every transfer junction and had told his men they were authorized to shoot anything that did not have a face they recognized. Still, a door clicked. A light flickered. A shadow that did not belong to anything present passed along a wall and decided to stop behaving like a shadow. An energy pike sprang to life in a hand that did not tremble. A blast shield stuttered and then found its backbone again. "Contact!" A voice snapped into life on Fox's internal channel. Clipped, unpanicked. Level 9, North Corridor. Unidentified assailant with Force signature. Fox didn't bother to swear. He spared half a breath to thank whatever power held the temple that Anakin and Obi-Wan had thought to take their swords with them, and the other half to admire the courage in Appo's tone. Then he said, "Hold and pin. Do not pursue." Herd him toward the hard angles. He wants a straight line. Give him corners. Maul took the corners and turned them into lines by moving as if the angles were part of his body. Red light wrote a grammar the men with pikes were not trained to read. He wanted the cell. He wanted the man in it. He wanted to strike at the god that had abandoned him. He wanted to feed a wound that always felt better when other men bled. The passage shuddered as his blade scored a line along a shield that chose to hum instead of fail. Sparks jumped like fruit flies. "On me," Cody said in Fox's ear, the words arriving without ceremony. "Rex with me. We'll push him to Bay 12. Fox, make 12 a door to a pit." "Copy," Fox said, and made 12 collapse into a spillway that would drop a man 10 meters onto a cushion that was not a cushion at all but a web of stunners set to a setting a human nervous system would call disrespectful. Ahsoka was moving before her eyes opened fully from the dark beneath the temple. She caught Obi-Wan's glance, saw the question there, and shook her head once. "Go," she said. "I'll take the lift. You take the air." Obi-Wan rose. Yoda's eyes were on him. "Finished we are not," the old master said. "We never are," Obi-Wan returned. He touched the floor with his fingers and stood. The Force moved around him like a cloak accepted at the door. Anakin was already running. He took the terrace at a leap, hit the speeder's saddle, and cut hard right into the river. Traffic parted because it had learned to part for him years ago, the way a city learns certain names and makes room for them like weather. Obi-Wan dropped into the passenger seat and strapped in without fumbling, which he would not admit to later even to himself. "Level 9, Anakin said. "North Corridor. Bay 12, Obi-Wan said, and braced as Anakin threaded a needle between a lorry and a courier so close the lorry driver would tell a story about it for years in a cantina that smelled of oil and home. They hit the platform running. The door blew inward just as they arrived. 3 bodies flung into the hall by a hand that invented new angles for anatomy to object to. Rex rolled, came up on a knee, and snapped a shot that would have clipped a lesser thing's ear. Maul batted it aside as if bored. His eyes were bright and emptier than they had any right to be. "You," he said, and the word was a mouth full of ash. "You always have time for us," Obi-Wan said. Maul's mouth bared his teeth in what failed to be a smile even in his own head. "He is mine." "He is no one's," Anakin said, and stepped in hard enough that the floor thought about cracking. Blue met red. The corridor lit in a blink, went dark, lit again as sabers passed through air that had never expected to host this kind of conversation. Maul moved like the memory of a duel on Naboo turned inside out and set on fire. He wanted Obi-Wan's throat with the intensity of a man who had built furniture for his hate. He wanted Anakin's hands. He wanted the door. He wanted, beneath it all, a father to kill properly this time. Obi-Wan gave him patience. Anakin gave him speed. Rex and Cody gave him walls. Fox gave him electricity. The corridor gave him distance calculated in size. He turned, looking for the line, and found instead a net. The exact kind of net he had used on others. The exact kind he despised because it treated him like a beast to be managed instead of a god to be served. He snarled and poured lightning into it from muscles that had learned the lesson late and learned it well. The net glowed purple for a heartbeat and then decided to be a net anyway. He dropped to a knee as it contracted. Anakin moved to take his weapon. Obi-Wan put a hand to his wrist. "Do not touch the blade," he said softly. "Let it die in the air." They watched the red line shiver once, flicker, and vanish. Maul panted, looking up at Obi-Wan with a hatred so familiar it was almost an intimate. Then he laughed, a sound that didn't bother to find humor to justify itself. "You've won a night," he said. "The galaxy lives longer than your breath." "Good," Obi-Wan said. "I prefer long projects." They carried him, electrified, bound, muzzled not because he would bite but because men looking at him needed to believe that it mattered, to a cell where light behaved and locks took their work seriously. Palpatine sat in his and watched them pass with a calm that would have earned him respect in another life. "2 of my failures in one haul," he murmured. "What a touching procession." Maul snarled behind the mesh. "You gave me nothing." "I gave you purpose," Palpatine said, and for a sliver of time the mask slipped and Obi-Wan saw not a man but a method that had been embodied as a man because methods are harder to arrest. "You chose obsession. You could have been a king of trash. You decided to be a dog." Maul threw himself at the mesh and found that power had opinions about touching him. He sagged back, panting, eyes like coals in a fire no one had bothered to tend with anything but desire. Palpatine smiled at Obi-Wan through his cuffs. "You'll never heal the foundations," he said conversationally. "Men prefer old lies if the new truth requires humility." Obi-Wan regarded him, lord of plans caught without an exit he could see. "Men prefer purpose," he said, "and they will choose humility if it is offered with dignity." He turned away because attention was a currency he would no longer spend on this man in any quantity unnecessary to the ledger. Anakin fell in beside him as they left the block. His breath came in even pulls. He shook residual lightning off his fingers as a man might flick rain from the cuff of a coat. "He'll try again," he said, meaning both of them. "He will," Obi-Wan agreed. "So will we." They rode the lift in silence. Outside, Coruscant poured light down the tower. Traffic moved. A banner flapped on a high wind and decided not to fall. The temple stood. Under it, the hum had gone from a hunger to a patient ache. In a garden where a fountain talked to itself because no one else wanted to, Rex and Ahsoka sat with their backs to a low wall and watched Padawans unlearn the nervous habit of looking over their shoulders when they laughed. Cody leaned the back of his head against stone and closed his eyes. A cherry-colored speeder buzzed past the garden's edge, and the boy in the passenger seat pointed at the temple with a style of excitement that suggested belief in impossible things had not yet been taxed into compliance. Days found their pace. In the Senate, Masameda failed to find a good place to stand and then failed to find a reason to stay standing. He went home to paper notes with too many zeros and a door without a key for the last lock. Mon Mothma took the floor and spoke about process and about mercy for men who had chosen wrong from fear. Bail followed her and reminded the chamber that the Republic had been built not to make men rich but to offer them a standard by which to measure themselves. Padme returned to her seat with a wrapped bundle against her heart and a quiet like steel behind her softness. When she spoke, the room leaned in. "I have buried enough lies to know the smell of them," she said. And the words were not shouted and therefore carried farther. "If we are to keep this republic, we must learn to sit with discomfort and not build monsters when patience would do. We will make mistakes. We will say so. We will repair. That is the work." Citizens listened to the speeches and then went about their lives. Work continued. Markets opened. Children ran. Men who had carried rifles on contract for 3 years stared at their hands and made very different choices with them. Clones lined up at surgical wards on dozens of worlds and let droids they did not love save them. Some left as soon as the bandages came off, seeking farms or freighters or just a room in a city with a window that faced east. Some stayed and joined a defense corps that would increasingly look like the Republic they served, a mix of clones and volunteers and men who had never known how to stop defending something once they had started. The word brother acquired a meaning outside the barracks and mutated into neighbor. Yoda taught. Not from the center chair in the high room so much as at corners of halls and on stairs where light fell in bright trapezoids, in gardens where fruit hung like disciplined generals, in the small, echoing practice chambers where a youngling might think to kick off his shoes and then be caught and smiled at. He taught Anakin how to let go of an image offered by a lie without losing the part of him that made him a father who checked his sleeping child twice in the night. He taught Obi-Wan how to leave a window open in the mind that did not admit drafts but welcomed a friend. One evening, when the light slanted in a particular way that made dust look like a gift, Yoda beckoned them both into a room that had no right angles and smelled faintly of candles. "Ready you are," he said. "For a path most choose only when the feet no longer obey." He closed his eyes. The room changed temperature, not colder, not warmer, but nearer. A sound like breath drawn very far away and exhaled close by moved through the space. Obi-Wan felt it before he heard it, the way one feels a familiar hand on the shoulder just before it lands. Then the voice came, not as a shimmering form and not through the ear, but as a line crossing the distance between past and present the way a bridge announces itself a half step before a foot lands. "Obi-Wan," Qui-Gon said, and laughter threaded his name. "About time." Obi-Wan closed his eyes and then opened them, because he did not want to miss seeing Anakin hear it too. Anakin's mouth had fallen open. His eyes burned in the best way. "Master," Obi-Wan said softly, "I made a mess of the instructions." "That's what they're for," Qui-Gon said, warmth in the crackle. "You kept the boy alive. He kept the world honest." The laughter softened. "You listened at last." Anakin swallowed around something that would have been grief if it weren't so full of gratitude it had no room left for sorrow. "I should have. There were so many nights I wanted this. I had dreams." "I did too," the voice said. "I begged the Force to give me a door. Took its time. It had to teach me something first. It had to teach you something too." Pause, tender. "You've done well, both of you." Yoda watched them as one watches children who have found the thing hidden in the garden at last. Then he thumped his stick gently. "Always more learning there is," he said. "But this keep, not for comfort, for courage." In the months that followed, the Order remapped its halls on paper and in its habits. The creche opened to parents, not as visitors but as partners. A pilot from Ord Mantell came on weekends to teach children the names of clouds, while a weaver from Chandrila taught them what patience looks like when it becomes cloth. Trials changed shape. Younglings went to farms as often as they went to battlefields, to learn how to take a seed in hand and imagine a meal 2 seasons from now. The council sat less above and more among. They met sometimes in the high room because ritual needs its place, and sometimes in a tiled kitchen because truth lives there. Attachments were given a new word, responsibilities, and treated with the respect both burden and blessing deserve. Anakin took a class of pilots out at dawn and came back with them at noon dusty and flushed, hands talking even when mouths kept pace. He learned to leave early when he could because Padme pretended not to time him, but the twins did. Luke with more patience than Leia, who threw her entire body at a greeting because life demanded it. He learned that a lightsaber makes for poor swaddling and that the Force has a sense of humor about wet diapers. He went to Tatooine with Obi-Wan one week when the twins were new enough to smell like something written in the oldest language men remember. They stood on the ridge at dusk when the 2 sons sat politely one after the other. Anakin found Shmi's grave and brushed sand from the stone with the side of his hand and said sentences he had not known he was carrying, small and important as nails. Obi-Wan stood a careful distance away, a presence without pressure, and watched the sky throw its color up and then fold it down again like a sheet dried on a line. They left flowers that looked ridiculous in that light and returned to Coruscant with dust in their boots and something unknotted inside them that had been there since before language. Ahsoka did not rejoin the Order in the old sense. She did not put on a Padawan's braid or a knight's fine patience with paperwork. She moved in the city like a rumor that chose useful ears. She taught in the training halls on days when laughter needed to be louder than effort, and in the back rows of Senate hearings when a senator needed to know that the word constituent had faces. She worked with Bo-Katan to unpick Mandalore's knots without pulling them so hard the fabric tore again. Sometimes she sparred with Anakin, and they argued about footwork and afterward ate noodles from a stand whose owner had taught her to slurp like a local. Sometimes she sat with Rex on a low wall and said nothing for long stretches because their bodies had learned the rhythm of quiet together and it felt like home. Maul sat in a cell that light refused to break and watched the walls for weakness. He found none and worked instead on the seams of his mind, worrying at old stitches until they bled. He learned the guard rotations. He learned the names of men by the sound their boots made on the floor. He knew all along that he would leave. He did not know whether he would leave as a man climbing out through a vent that someone forgot to secure or as a body carried out draped. The not knowing fed him. One night he heard the smallest scratch in the duct above his head and smiled at it as if it were a friend he had been expecting. A week later, a panel loosened. A month later, a mouse droid came and went with a packet of food that tasted like dust and victory. He prepared. Palpatine prepared too. He did not pace. He did not press his hands against the wall as if pressure could impress itself on stone. He sat and listened to the lines he had laid under the city find themselves severed, one by one. He waited for the one no one else had found yet. It would be small. It would be a single man with a single charge and a sense of duty that had been carefully taught to bend in one specific direction. He would not need armies when he had devotion. The matter found him on an afternoon when Coruscant's sky was the color of a bruise. A guard came to the door bringing water. He was small and neat and new in his armor. His visor reflected the old man's face back at him in miniature. Palpatine looked at him and said the guard's name, which the guard had never told anyone outside the barracks except his sister on a planet far from this one, and the guard's hands shook just enough to make the water ripple. Palpatine said the sister's name. He said the town where she lived. He said the worth of a life measured in numbers and the worth of the word forgiven measured in breath. The guard did not open the door. He did not shoot the prisoner. He stood still and wept, quiet as a man who knows how thin the walls are. Then he turned and walked away. Palpatine smiled at the ceiling. "We are all learning," he said. The tribunal presented its sentence in the end as a calm piece of paper that would be studied by men who love studying and by some who do not. It was strong enough to hold the weight placed on it by history. It gave to the office of the Chancellor back to the Senate the authority that had been stolen from it. It recognized that some powers should not be vested in an office at all. It forbade for a generation the concentration of military command in any one person's hands. It created, with the Order's cooperation, civilian oversight committees that would sit and ask annoying questions of men who thought themselves too busy to answer. It did not make everyone happy. It did not fail. Palpatine went to a new cell in a place designed to feel like nowhere. Men followed him there. Some did so to look at evil and learn. On a morning when the twins were loud and the temple bells were rather more energetic than usual, Anakin came into the council kitchen to find Obi-Wan standing at the counter looking at a peculiar piece of fruit as if it would tell him a parable. "They're full of it today," Anakin said, meaning the children and the bells and perhaps the whole blessed city. "They are," Obi-Wan agreed. He cut the fruit and revealed a luminous interior, seeds set in a helix. "What is that?" Anakin asked. "A teacher brought it from Yavin," Obi-Wan said. He told the children that not everything that glows is dangerous. "Wise," Anakin said. He stole a slice and made a face. "Sour. Also wise," Obi-Wan said. He leaned his hip against the counter and watched Anakin's hands reach for another slice anyway. "I used to believe the Force asked us for austerity because desire was dangerous. I find now it asks something more interesting. Honesty." Anakin chewed and nodded. "Desire tells you what you fear," he said, "and what you'll refuse to lose." "Exactly," Obi-Wan said, "and then asks you to choose what is worth protecting without making everything worth destroying." He cut another slice. "You've become very dull in your old age, Anakin." Anakin looked up, eyes bright. "And you've gotten interesting." He sobered. "Thank you." "For what?" Obi-Wan asked, genuinely curious. "For standing with me at the window," Anakin said. "For choosing the wrong door to keep it closed. For telling me the truth even when I was the last person who deserved it." Obi-Wan set the knife down. He let the words pass through him and find a place to sit. "I should have told you sooner that love is not a thing to be excised," he said. "It's a thing to be aimed." Anakin laughed softly. "Padme says the same thing with fewer words." "She always was more efficient," Obi-Wan said, and then turned his head because the bells shifted in their pattern. The signal for a ship arriving that required attention. The ship that dropped through the traffic lanes carried the blue pennant of Kashyyyk and a pair of Wookiee elders whose voices had warmed the high woods when words were not enough. Chewbacca thumped Anakin on the shoulder and offered a child a treat that looked like bark and tasted like smoked sugar. Tarful pressed his head to Yoda's in an embrace that made both small and enormous at once. They came to thank and to ask for lumberjacks, of all things. A storm had taken down too many trees in one district, and they needed men who knew how to cut with respect. The Order found 20 such men within the hour, because it turned out that knowing where to put a blade was a transferable skill. On a night when the temple's lamps burned down to a golden drift and the city had decided, for once, to whisper rather than sing, Obi-Wan stood again by the window and felt, like a hand on the other side of glass, the press of a presence that had not visited since the day in the candle room. "You still watching?" he asked the knight. "I always was," Qui-Gon said, amused. "You were busy." Obi-Wan smiled. "He will be afraid again," he said, meaning Anakin, meaning all of them. "We will all be." "Yes," Qui-Gon said. But you'll answer it with better words now. What would you have said to him in that office if you had lived? Obi-Wan asked, and it was not a plea. It was a craftsman asking another what tool he would have chosen. Qui-Gon's laughter ran like a rill down rocks. The same thing you did, he said. Together. Maul left, as he had always planned to, through a hole no one else had known to look for. He went into a night that welcomed him because night welcomes everyone. He built again. He called what he built by a new name because men love new names. Crimson Dawn stroked its cat in private and then took its claws out in public. Dryden Voss bought art and paid for blood. A boy with yellow eyes in the outer rim learned to keep a knife in his boot. The galaxy continued, which is what galaxies do. Sometimes it does so wisely. On a small hill on Naboo, Padme spread a blanket and set the twins down on a patchwork of sun and shadow. Anakin lay on his side and watched Leia try to boss a grasshopper into obedience, and Luke watched the grasshopper without judging it. Obi-Wan lay on his back and let sunlight teach his scars a new language. Mon Mothma and Bail Organa arrived late, carrying a basket and the kind of politeness that only old friends bother to preserve. They ate and then talked about work in the way one does when the work is worth doing. Someone laughed so hard that the grasshopper took offense and flew away, buzzing like a tiny ship. There were still nights when the city tried to lean back into old habits. Once, a riot broke out 2 districts over when a demagogue told men that their suffering was easier to solve if one pointed at robed figures and called them arrogant. Ahsoka stood on a fountain rim and spoke about light without using the word at all. Rex and Fox walked the line and refused to raise batons and discovered that sometimes not striking first is a kind of strike that lands better. The demagogue went home and wrote a quieter speech. The men who had shouted went home and slept poorly and woke up less certain of what they had been certain of. Another time, a power station failed and a neighborhood went dark for 3 days. The temple sent lanterns and then sent people to sit and talk. Obi-Wan played Dejarik with an old woman who had lost her son in a factory accident 10 years before and still kept his jacket in a closet because the smell had faded too slowly and then too fast. Anakin fixed a broken repulsor so a man could go to work. A child learned to feel a thread of force in her fingers when she passed water to an elder, and the cup did not slop because she was careful with her attention. The lights came back on. No one cheered. They didn't need to. Yoda died years later, not on a lonely rock in a swamp, but in a chair in a garden that had listened to him for a long time. He did not vanish immediately, because vanishing is dramatic and unnecessary. He looked at Anakin and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka and said something so small it took them a minute to realize it was the point. "Keep going," he said. Then he laughed to himself and added, "Eat, sleep, kiss the children." He became light without leaving a mess, because he had always been tidy. Palpatine died in his cell not long after, like a book closing in the middle because the reader had decided to go outside. Men came to look at his body and tried to learn. Some learned humility, that plans are not God's. Some learned nothing. There is no cure for that. The temple's foundation held. Stone was replaced slowly as promised. No ceremony marked the final block brought up from below and set in place, because drama does not make things truer. The hum never left. It changed. It became a note one could tune to when the city got loud. Children learned to feel it and to say, without shame, "I need a quiet moment." And men made space for them in lines and at tables and in the arguments of a republic that deserved the work it still demanded. On an ordinary morning when the bells had been particularly well behaved, a youngling asked Anakin if heroes always win. Anakin considered the question and the boy and the way sunlight pooled on the floor near the door. "No," he said, "heroes don't always win, but they always show up." The boy nodded as if this answered something bigger than the question he had asked. He ran off to spar with a friend. Anakin stood for a minute and watched him and then went home to lift a daughter who had learned to climb onto chairs and a son who had learned to ask why in 10 languages. He kissed Padme and picked up a toolbox because the cabinet was loose again. He fixed it without using the Force because sometimes skill is the correct answer to power. Obi-Wan walked into the kitchen later and found Anakin, for the second time that month, with a screwdriver in his mouth. He took it out gently and put it on the counter. "You're going to teach them terrible habits," he said, nodding toward the twins, who watched their father with identical expressions of criticism and awe. I'm going to teach them to fix their own cabinets, Anakin retorted. Padme, writing notes in the margin of a speech, didn't look up. Teach them to vote, too, she said. It helps. We'll get there, Anakin promised, and meant it in the largest sense and in the smallest. Flatheads and ballots, sabers and lullabies. At dusk, Obi-Wan returned to the temple and found Ahsoka on the balcony above the east gate. She stood with her arms folded and her weight on one hip, looking at the river of traffic as if it were a story she liked hearing because it always ended with someone getting home. Do you ever think about what we almost did? She asked without turning. About the versions of us who didn't turn at the right time? Every day, Obi-Wan said. And then I try to forgive them for their lack of our luck. She nodded. Luck, she said, and choice, and kindness extended at the right moment, he added. I find that's what saved me more than anything. That and being forced to admit I was wrong. Your favorite, Ahsoka said, smiling. My best lesson, he returned. Night slid across Coruscant. The traffic rivers shone. The temple breathed. Somewhere far below, in a room where books were still heavy and chairs insisted on the upright, a student opened a page and found a sentence that made the world simpler, and then harder, and then exactly as complex as it had always been. Somewhere far above, a ship slipped into hyperspace carrying a senator and a small delegation of men with calluses who would advise a distant planet on flood control. On a level in between, a boy fell asleep with his head on his father's shoulder to the rhythm of a heart that had almost been taught to betray him and had learned instead to keep time. The force flowed. It did not promise an end to storms. It promised hands to hold when one stepped into them. It promised that sometimes, when a window opened into a night used to swallowing hope, two figures would step through together. It promised the hum beneath the stone would settle if fed with listening rather than contempt. It promised nothing anyone could sue for breach of. It gave anyway, and in a city built of light layered over shadow layered over older light, two men who had once stood on a balcony with a wind in their faces and decided to be braver than their fear grew older, as men do when they are given that mercy. They learned to be different kinds of strong. They learned to apologize quicker. They learned to accept help without mistaking it for weakness. They learned slowly and then all at once that the work is the point, not the parade. The night listened and kept their secret, which was no secret at all. Together.